Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mohammed. I'll be your stickman guide for today. We will be analyzing the effects of trade between developed and developing countries and how trade barriers affect trade flows. We will start by examining the types of international trade and discuss its advantage and disadvantage as well. Finally, we will examine the types of trade barriers and their effect on trade flows between developed and developing countries. We will end by a case study that you might find interesting. There are various strategies for a developed country to enter the international market by expanding into developing economies. The techniques used vary in terms of risk, control, commitment of resources, and the return of investment promised. They can be mainly divided into two modes: non-equity and equity modes. We'll start by examining exporting and importing. The most used strategy of entering the scope of international business is import and export of materials, goods, and services. Exporting happens when goods or services produced in one country is sold in another country, whether directly when the firm is responsible for the carrying of the product or the service, or indirectly through an agent who would be responsible for giving the product and service in the other country. A good example is in Qatar. A Capco company, a Qatari company that manufactures petrochemicals in its home country and exports to many developing countries like Egypt. Next in line is licensing. Licensing has a limited level of risk. It involves giving the licensee patent rights, trademarks, copyrights, or know-how on product and process in exchange of license or royalty payment. On the other hand, the licensee produces the licensor's product or service, does marketing activities for them, and sells them in the assigned area. This type of agreement is generally welcomed by foreign public authorities because it brings technology into the country. The Murjani Group is a licensee who was licensed by very famous brands such as CK, FC UK, and Tommy Hilfiger, who operate in developed countries, and now they licensed Murjani Group to operate and sell their products in India. The next type we'll be speaking about is franchising. Franchising can be defined as a system in which semi-independent business owners, known as franchisees, pay fees and royalties to a parent company which is the franchisor in return for the right to become identified with its trademark, to sell its products or services, and often to use business format and system. It's different from licensing that the franchising organization is to a larger extent directly involved in the development and control of the marketing program. Franchising agreements are longer than license agreements with a larger package of rights. Just Falafel, which started in Abu Dhabi and went international through franchising contracts, is now operating in many developed and developing countries such as Egypt, UK, and the US. Falafel sandwich! Now moving to equity modes, we'll start with strategic alliances. A strategic alliance is a term used to describe a variety of cooperative agreements between different firms, such as a shared research, formal joint ventures, or minority equity participation. It's usually made for the objective of technology exchange. The modern form of strategic alliances is becoming increasingly popular. KLM and Kenya Air had a strategic alliance which allowed KLM to have access to African countries and allowed Kenya Air to elevate its level of service. We'll now speak about joint ventures. It's defined as a partnership between host and home country firms, usually resulting in the creation of a third firm. This type of agreement gives the international firm better control over operations and also access to local market knowledge. The international firm has access to the network of relationships of the franchisee and is less exposed to risk in the host country thanks to the partnership with the local firm. Japanese car manufacturer Mazda created a joint venture with Bermaz, a Malaysian company, under the name of Mazda Malaysia to manufacture the CX-5 model for the Malaysian market. The last form of equity mode is direct investment. In this case, the international firm makes a direct investment in a production unit in a foreign market. It's the greatest commitment since there's a 100% ownership. There are two primary ways of direct investment. Firms can make a direct acquisition in the host market, or they can develop its own facilities from the ground up. This form is called greenfield investment. In this case, the firm runs its own production facilities, marketing programs, manpower, and strategic objectives. HSBC is a well-known banking service provider which started in the UK, and after a short period of time, HSBC bank branches and headquarters can be found all over the world. We'll now speak about advantages of international trade between developed and developing countries. The first one is that countries complete each other's needs. Each country has its unique products. International trade gives the ability to countries to benefit from others' productions. For example, we all love coffee, but not all countries have a climate that accommodates the growth of these plants. But Brazil, for example, is a country with the right climate to grow coffee. The UK can import coffee from Brazil, and they'll import other UK products. International trade also helps strengthening economies. Trade involves money going in and out, and that money means profit. International trading helps the economy of the countries involved to grow. Most of the developing economies rely on products being manufactured on their land and then exporting them to other countries to empower their economy. It also creates jobs and more choice for customers. If you go to the supermarket today in Bradford, you will find products from all over the world. International trade also increases innovative ideas. International trading means less borders, which means more people, which is a bigger market. A bigger market means more opportunities to innovators to spot a market gap and create new product or service to sell. Finally, one of the biggest advantages of international trade is economies of scale and specialization. When business goes international, they benefit from the bigger market they get. They could produce their products and services on a bigger scale, thus decreasing overhead costs. From that, they can pay more for R&D, thus bettering their products and even specializing in a certain product. An example for that is German car manufacturers like BMW and Mercedes.
No, wait. What about the disadvantages?
Disadvantages? I'll be back!
Hello, I'm John, and I will be talking about the disadvantages of international trade. The first disadvantage is that it dissolves culture. With international products going everywhere in the world, cultural differences are decreasing. International trade dissolves cultural values and traditions, especially in developing countries. For example, the McDonald's burger chain affected the eating habits in many countries, making them consume more of their products and less of their traditional food. If this case continues, eventually cultural differences will completely disappear. Secondly, it weakens local production. With international businesses benefiting from economies of scale, they are able to decrease costs and thus their prices, which in turn affect local businesses that operate on a smaller budget and can compete with their prices, making many small local businesses leave the market. Furthermore, powerful countries can control developing ones. On the international stage, the more powerful a country is, the more control it could have over less powerful or developing countries. Because of this, less developed countries usually do not get a good deal out of trade. Also, on a political level, some powerful countries might back up a dictator in order for them to gain better advantages from the trade within their country. Finally, harmful substances can be exported all over the world. Substances like tobacco, drugs, or alcohol thrive in the markets of developing countries. Because of the disadvantages of international trade, organizations and local authorities have designed trade barriers to stop trade. Trade barriers are measures that governments or public authorities introduce to make imported goods or services less competitive than locally produced goods and services. But what are the types of trade barriers? There are tariffs, import quotas, exchange controls, subsidies, which are also considered to be a trade barrier, administrative barriers, and finally embargoes. There are many positive points about trade barriers. First of all, they protect domestic jobs from cheap labor abroad. That goes specifically for developed countries when they hire local workers from developing countries. Overall, wages in the industrialized countries are higher because their output per worker is also higher, and their workers are more qualified. In contrast to developing countries, where the workers are not qualified and are generally paid less. Furthermore, they improve trade deficits and equalize exports to imports by making imports more expensive and exports more competitive. Thirdly, they use trade barriers to protect infant industries or senile industries. Countries want to give newly developing industries time to grow and become more competitive. Or, in the case of senile industries, they want to help their old industries to become more competitive in the global market. An example of this is the Olympic Airways. It's an airline in Greece which was too old and had too much debt and could not be competitive in the global market anymore, so the Greek government tried, through trade barriers and subsidies, to make it more competitive and the pride of the Greece again. Furthermore, trade barriers protect from dumping. Dumping is when imports are sold at below world average cost. Finally, it provides more revenue. Governments gain extra revenue by imposing tariffs, which are taxes on imports.
No, I don't agree.
What are you going to do, kill me?
Exactly. I think trade barriers has so many disadvantages. First of all, they cause damage to consumers. Frequently, tariffs can be regressive, hurting the poorest consumers the most. Trade barriers on food, clothing, and raw materials raise prices on necessities, which make up the largest expense for those with lower incomes. Often, tariffs cause inflation. Also, a restriction of economic growth. Opponents of protectionism argue that trade barriers restrict the flow of capital and inhibit economic growth. The third point is that discouragement of innovation and efficiency. Some argue that trade barriers insulate inefficient producers from competition and, as a consequence, discourage the innovation that contributes to future growth. Also, by favoring some manufacturers rather than the free market, protectionist measures can force economic activity toward the less efficient or lower quality producer. Finally, encouragement of trade wars. Trade wars are often the direct result of protectionist policies. A trade war occurs when a country raises trade barriers in retaliation for another's trade barriers. Each country involved in the trade war thereby loses some access to the market of the other. As a result, trade and economic activity decrease. I hope you enjoyed this part.
Thank you for your attention.